Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've built around Krenko, Mob Boss, a mono-red commander most recently reprinted in Ravnica Remastered. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including our basic lands at 10 cents a piece, but this won't include the cost of shipping. Also, a quick shout out to Slanter for suggesting this deck. Apologies for it taking me a while. Commander recommendations are always appreciated, just there's so many potential commanders out there that my to-build pile can get quite large. So, Krenko, Mob Boss is a 3/3 legendary goblin warrior costing 2 generic and 2 red to cast, and can be tapped to create X 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, where X is the number of goblins you control. So clearly Krenko wants to have a huge number of goblin creature spells to cast alongside himself to get as much value from his ability, and we'll definitely have a go wide with weenie strategy. And for deck goals, it's just goblins, just many goblins that we'll try to buff. But let's get into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. As this is a goblins deck, let's start with a couple of goblins with Treasure Nabber and Goblin War Chief. Treasure Nabber basically makes it so that we share everyone else's mana rocks, as when an opponent taps an artifact for mana, we gain control of that artifact until the end of our next turn. And Goblin War Chief makes it so our goblins cost 1 less generic to cast, while giving our goblins haste, which will apply to a large chunk of this deck. Then Wayfarer's Bauble lets us tutor a basic land directly onto the battlefield tapped. And then to get into our mana rocks, for generic mana we have Prismatic Lens, Mind Stone, Liquimetal Torque, Fractured Power Stone, and the Iron Crag, each costing 2 to cast and entering untapped. And it's also good to note that the Iron Crag's transform ability is a May effect, so you can keep it as a mana rock if you wish when a legendary creature enters the battlefield. Then Fire Diamond and Glittering Stockpile will tap for red mana, with Glittering Stockpile gaining counters whenever you tap it for mana, and then can be sacrificed to gain X mana of any color, where X is the number of counters that were on it. Felwar Stone is likely to tap for red in a 4-player game, but if not, we can still use the mana for generic costs. And Arcane Signet will tap for red. And finally, as this is a mono red deck, Heraldic Banner will let us buff all of our red creatures with +1 power, while also tapping for a red mana. But let's start going over the many goblins in this deck, well, those that aren't part of any other particular chapter. First up are some low drop goblins that we can get out quickly with Goblin Fireslinger, Goblin Arsonist, Goblin Mountaineer, and Foundry Street Denizen, which are all 1-drop 1/1 goblins. Goblin Medics deals 1 damage to any target whenever it becomes tapped. Then we have Goblin Instigator and Beetleback Chief, which make 1 and 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens when they enter the battlefield, respectively. And Goblin Trap Runner has you flip 3 coins when it attacks, and you make a 1/1 red goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking for each of those flipped coins that you win. Goblin Chain Whirler is a 3/3 for 3 red with First Strike, and it deals 1 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker and creature they control upon entering the battlefield. Goblin Pile Driver is a 1/2 that, when it attacks, it gets +2 power for each other attacking goblin, as well as having protection from blue. And finally, Goblin Goon is a 6/6 that can't attack or block unless you control more creatures than the defending or attacking player, respectively. Though, given the focus of this deck is getting as many goblin creatures onto the field as possible, this should rarely be a problem when Goblin Goon's on the field. But with that, let's take a look at the various spells that we can use to buff our board of goblins. First up are Quest for the Goblin Lord, Goblin Lookout, and Battlecry Goblin, with Quest for the Goblin Lord gaining a quest counter for each goblin that enters the battlefield under your control, and it gives creatures you control +2 power when it has 5 or more quest counters on it. Goblin Lookout lets us sack a goblin to give all our goblins +2 power for the turn, and Battlecry Goblin has an activated ability to give your goblins +1 power and haste for the turn, and if you attack with Battlecry Goblin and the total power of all creatures attacking is at least 6, you make a 1/1 red goblin token that's also tapped and attacking. Then Shared Animosity has it so, whenever a creature's attack, they gain +1 power until the end of the turn for each other attacking creature that shares a creature type with it. Hammer of Purphoros gives our creatures haste, which would let us swing with our immense pile of goblins that we make each turn instead of having to wait. And then we have a pile of Anthem effects, starting with Runvelt Horde Master, which gives our other goblins +1/+1, and gives us some potential to dig further into our deck. Goblin Chieftain gives our other goblins +1/+1 in haste. Goblin King gives all goblins Mountain Walk, so they can't be blocked by anyone controlling a mountain, and +1/+1. Hobgoblin Bandit Lord gives our other goblins +1/+1, and can be used to deal damage equal to the number of goblins that enter the battlefield under your control that turn to any target. And finally, Vanquisher's Banner is a great tribal card, as you get to choose a creature type upon it entering the battlefield, and it gives creatures of that type +1/+1, and you draw a card whenever you cast one. Now, there's a few additional effects that aren't super heavily represented in this deck, but can heavily accelerate our game that I'd like to talk about. First up are some untapping effects so that we can access Krenko's ability for a second time in a turn, which includes Jandor's Saddlebags, Mobile Garrison, and Sting, the Glinting Dagger. The first simply with an activated ability to untap a creature. Mobile Garrison is a vehicle that lets you untap a creature whenever it attacks, and Sting untaps its equipped creature at the beginning of each combat, letting you make goblins during every player's turn if you wish. Then we have Bogart Shenanigans, Warstorm Surge, and Impact Tremors, where Bogart Shenanigans lets you deal 1 damage to a target player when a goblin you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield. Warstorm Surge has creatures entering the battlefield deal damage equal to its power to any target, and Impact Tremors deals 1 damage to each opponent when a creature enters the battlefield under your control. But now, let's move on to the spells that we can use to either interact with what our opponents are doing, or, given Krenko is likely to wind up with a target on his back from our opponents, some protection for our stuff. I'm first going to bring up Grenzo, Havoc Raiser, who makes it so, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you can choose to either go to target creature they control, or exile the top card of that player's library, which you can cast that turn and spend mana as though it were any color to cast that spell. Then for full-on interaction spells, we have Lightning Bolt, dealing 3 damage to any target, and Goblin Grenade, which has a sack a goblin as its additional cost, but it deals 5 damage to any target. Then Arms Dealer lets us sack a goblin to deal 4 damage to a target creature. Goblin Crater Maker can be sacked to either deal 2 damage to a target player, or destroy a colorless non-land permanent. Byforce is an X spell that lets us destroy X target artifacts, which could be useful as a kind of targeted artifact wipe. Then Mizium Mortars deals 4 damage to a target creature you don't control, but if it's cast for its overload cost, it'll deal 4 damage to each creature we don't control for a one-sided board wipe for smaller creatures. But if we need more damage for a board wipe, we have Starstorm and Delete, X cost spells that deal X damage to each creature and each non-artifact creature and player, respectively. Given Krenko can really make a board state go out of hand quickly, it's not unlikely that it'll become the target of removal from someone, so we have a few cards in this deck that can be used to help keep Krenko around a little bit longer. Goblin Chirurgeon lets us sack a goblin to regenerate a target creature, so it can bring back Krenko if somebody tries to destroy him. But we also have Mask of Avacyn, Mirror Shield, and Swiftfoot Boots, each of which giving its equipped creature hexproof. Now, red isn't exactly known for its card advantage, but we do have a handful of cards that will help us keep from burning through our hand and top decking entirely, even if it's not directly draw. First up, Ren's Resolve and Light Up the Stage will have you exile the top 2 cards of your library, which you can play until the end of your next turn. Then Outpost Siege has you choose either Khans or Dragons when it enters the battlefield, with Khans having you exile the top card of your library at the beginning of your upkeep, which you can play until the end of that turn. Dark Dweller Oracle lets you sack a creature to exile the top card of your library, which you can play that turn. And Goblin Ringleader has you reveal the top 4 cards of your library when it enters the battlefield, of which you can put all goblin cards into your hand, and put the rest onto the bottom of your library in any order. Goblin Matron is a goblin tutor, as when it enters the battlefield, you can search your library for a goblin card, which you reveal and put into your hand. Then finally, for some straight up draw, Arcane Encyclopedia lets you draw for 3 mana, Idol of Oblivion lets you draw just for simply tapping it, provided you made a token that turn. Endless Atlas lets you draw for 2 mana, provided you control at least 3 lands with the same name, and as we'll see shortly, there's a bunch of basic mountains that will make it pretty easy to meet that requirement. And finally, Symmetry Matrix lets you draw a card if you pay 1 mana as a creature with power equal to its toughness enters the battlefield under your control, of which our goblin tokens and many of our non-token creatures will meet. But now that we've gone through all of the spells in this deck, let's quickly go over our land base. First up we have Forgotten Cave, Smoldering Crater, and Desert of the Fervent, which can tap for red, but could also be cycled away if we happen to draw these at a time where we'd really prefer spells over lands. Castle Embereth taps for red, but can also be used to give all of our creatures +1 power for the turn, while Goblin Burrows can let us give a target goblin +2 power until the end of the turn. The Autonomous Furnace taps for red and can be sacked later on for a bit of card draw, and Path of Ancestry will tap for red in this deck, and if that mana is spent to cast a creature spell sharing a type with our commander, we scry 1, which we should be able to do frequently in this deck. Myriad Landscape can be used as a bit of land-based ramp, as it can be sacked to tutor 2 basics of the same type onto the battlefield tapped. And finally, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 28 basic mountains. But now that we've gone over all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see, this deck is currently listing just under $45 at the time of recording, which is including our basics at 10 cents each, but won't include the cost of shipping and the like. But before ending this video, there's a number of cards I'd like to quickly talk about that will work well with this deck if you're willing to put in a little bit more budget. First up, War Room will give us a little bit more access to draw while only having us pay 1 life to do so, as this is a monocolored deck. Bloodmark Mentor gives all of our red creatures we control first strike. Goblin Trash Master gives our other goblins +1/+1 and lets us sack a goblin to destroy a target artifact. Gauntlet of Power will give our red creatures +1/+1 and effectively make it so our basic mountains tap for 2 red mana instead of just 1. Patriarch Seal is a mana rock that can let us untap a legendary creature we control. And Brash Taunter is an indestructible goblin that, when it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to a target opponent, and it has an activated ability to fight a target creature, so you can effectively use someone's large creature against them. Goblin Goliath has an activated ability that makes it so sources we control deal double damage to an opponent that turn, while making a 1/1 red goblin token for each opponent we're playing against when it enters the battlefield. And finally, Perforos, God of the Forge, deals 2 damage to each opponent whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, and can be used to give the creatures we control +1 power for the turn. But with all that being said, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and if you'd like more budget commander decks, maybe consider dropping a sub. But regardless, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.